Welcome to Bridge the Divide podcast. A podcast where church leaders have real and honest conversations about issues of race and the way forward to racial reconciliation. Subscribe wherever you find podcasts or watch the video version over on YouTube.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to Bridge the Divide, the Protect and Serve episode. Yes. Protect and Serve is certainly what we want to talk about today. I'm Kirby, this is Matt, this is David. Yep. We're three pastors from Kenosha, Wisconsin. We're in the midst of building a multi-ethnic church, and we're so excited to be in the process of doing that. If you don't know our story, the three of us are just friends. We've been friends for about 10 years, and we thought it was important just in our journey to begin to share the conversations that we have every day in meetings, at lunch, as we're working together about race and faith and just all the things that are happening in our nation. And so today's episode, Protect and Serve. We want to have a conversation about law enforcement and some of the high profile cases that we've seen over the years. Let me begin by kind of laying the precedent and premise. Shout out to all of our law enforcement officials. We recognize that you have an extremely difficult job. I would say perhaps one of the most difficult career paths in our country is choosing to be a law enforcement officer. Yes. You have to make extremely difficult decisions in a split second. And so we definitely want to honor those who choose to serve in law enforcement and let you know that we're praying for you guys. Every police officer, every person that's part of command staff, every person that's part of support staff, we're praying for you guys because we recognize that what you do is extremely difficult on the daily basis. And so we certainly, as we have a conversation and even offer critique and all these different things, we definitely don't want to come off as if we don't appreciate and support what law enforcement means to our society and the work that is put in terms of law enforcement. Many of us know police officers. We walk with officers personally from a position of faith and all those kinds of things. And so we recognize that what you do is extremely difficult, and we definitely want to honor that as we have this conversation. Also, disclaimer, I'm going to start saying this regularly on our podcast. Oftentimes we quote individuals. When we quote people, we ask, please, that you allow the quote to stand alone. Please. And what I mean is don't ascribe everything a person ever said or wrote to my belief system or our belief system because we quoted one thing. So when we quote somebody, we ask that you give us the grace to allow that quote to stand on its own two legs. Okay? So
which, to be honest, even in the way you live your life, I'm feeling pastoral at the moment. No one's going to have everything all together. There's no theologian that I'm like, that guy nails it on every point. So as you take any quote in life, we don't embrace everything, but we're like, this is powerful for the moment. This is teaching truth. This is bringing information that's helpful. This is bringing a way of thinking that's helpful, just supporting what you're saying. So
that's good. One more disclaimer. Listen, you may agree or disagree with the things we say today or any of our podcasts. And listen, it's okay because nobody's dying. Nobody's died because of our disagreement. We love you. We pray that you still love us. And we don't expect everybody to always agree. But we want to try to find a way to disagree and have dialogue about these things without being disagreeable, I think is the term. So listen, there's no love lost as we walk through these challenges. And maybe you see things differently. Maybe you think we missed something. Again, we love your feedback. At the end of the podcast, we'll give you an email address if you want to reach out, if you got feedback, if you got critiques or rebukes or anything. Or you just want to say, I really enjoy what you guys are saying.
We prefer those emails. High praise.
I mean, those are the best.
High praise.
That's good.
I need that in my life.
So let's get into this conversation about law enforcement. We've seen so many things, especially recently. Polarizing cases. Just gut-wrenching, painful videos being released. And let me say this: anytime anybody loses their life, particularly in an incident where they have an interaction with a law enforcement official, it's tragic, right? Whether we're talking about like justified shootings or not, whatever the situation, it's always difficult. It's always hard to see, there's always family members that are involved, that kind of thing. Anytime an officer has to draw a weapon and unfortunately use it, it just is a tragic situation, regardless of the circumstances that lead to that point. So,
and I think our response, even as church leaders and as churches in general, and I know we're going to go into the deeper minutia of things, but just an overarching thing, our reaction should be one of weeping with those who weep. grieving with people who have lost.
Yeah.
And I think quickly we want to jump to answers and trying to figure out the situations. Okay, there's a time for that, but bro, let's grieve together a little bit. This is tragic. This is sad. This is awful. Can we weep with those who weep?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And this is the thing. As Christians, our response to these situations should not be, I'm going to give two extreme examples.
Okay.
Because this is stuff I see on like Twitter and Facebook that people kill those officers because they shouldn't be doing that to people.
Nope.
No Christian should respond like that.
Nope.
No.
But also, that jerk got what he deserved. He should have been killed. You know, either response is not acceptable for a believer.
Correct.
You know, so it shouldn't be this vindictive, destroy the police, kill the officer, eye for an eye, whatever you want to call it, response. But it also shouldn't be, well, that guy's a criminal and he got what he deserved either.
Absolutely that.
So as believers, we have to resist the temptation to be polarized in these issues. You know, and if there's a theme of some of the things we've talked about in this podcast repeatedly, and some people are going to view our perspectives as picking a side per se. I personally don't view it that way.
Yeah.
I think there's a temptation to be polarized in these types of issues, you know, and either you're this or you're that. And that's just not my perspective or our perspective, I don't believe. I think as we have these conversations, I think there's going to be space for reform or change that we see. But again, it's in the balance of also respecting what law enforcement does and the need for policing in our nation and why it matters, why it's important, and all those things. And those are certainly the things we want to talk about. So when we look at these cases, right, I guess there's at least a pattern of at least what we call high profile cases that seemingly got the attention of the nation. And in recent history, now one thing, we can go back generations with this issue, you know, and that's one of the things. And I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of history of policing in Black communities and how that plays a part in this conversation as well. But let's just go back recent history. Let's start with 2014. Probably the most polarizing case in recent history in terms of national attention would be Ferguson, Missouri, Mike Brown, right? That was probably the case, you know, that was the beginning of even the Black Lives Matter protest movement and how it kind of moved into activism versus just the hashtag prior to that. Like we talked about a couple podcasts ago, that it began after the George Zimmerman acquittal, after the Trayvon Martin, you know, that the hashtag began to surface then. And then this shooting took place, the Mike Brown situation. So we know Mike Brown is an 18-year-old high school student in Ferguson, Missouri, big guy. His nickname was Big Mike, right? That's what they called him. The police department gets a 911 call that this guy has stole some boxes of like Swisher Sweet cigars, you know, that are used for smoking marijuana. Let's be clear. The cigars are what people use. They cut them open, remove the tobacco, they put weed in them and smoke them, right? So they get the call that he stole them. He's confronted by a convenience store employee. Evidently, he shoved that employee, like they fell over a display, shoved him, and then walks out of the store. You know, then somebody again calls 911. The police see him and another individual walking down the street, and that's when this interaction began. This is a really difficult and painful story in a lot of ways. Honestly, my heart goes out for Mike Brown and his family, but it also goes out to this officer because it's a very difficult situation for this officer to be in. Because I was reading through the Department of Justice report, and to summarize the story, the officer pulls up. He sees the two individuals identified from the 911 call. He calls for backup and then begins to engage these two individuals. Now, the official report says he opened his door. His door comes in contact with Mike Brown's body. Either the door hit Mike Brown and then bounced back closed, or Mike Brown pushed it. The Department of Justice report kind of leaves that. They basically that's what the report says. It came in contact with his body. Either it bounced back closed or either one.
And to be clear, there were no body cams, right? In this.
I think there were.
There were.
I think so.
There were on this
Yeah.
one.
Yep.
There were body cams on this one.
Yeah, I think he didn't turn it on until he got out of the car. I'm not sure if I'm right. The DOJ report is an 86-page document that details everything. So I read pages 6 through 8 that details the actual call and what happened in that moment. So that's what I read through.
Okay, gotcha.
So that happens. The door slams shut. Then the report says that Mike Brown at some point reached into the car. And based on the forensic evidence, it looks as if he punched the police officer.
Yep.
There's some type of altercation. And what the officer stated was he couldn't, because he was seated in his vehicle, he didn't have access to his less lethal weapons.
Yeah.
In other words, because how he was seated, he couldn't get his taser, he couldn't get his OC spray, he certainly couldn't draw a baton and do everything. And so he reaches for his firearm. And so he pulls out his gun. Again, there's an altercation. And based on the forensic, it looks as if Mike Brown reached for the gun and shots are fired. He's hit in his hand. At that point, he kind of retreats from the car. The officer gets out. Now there's conflicting reports about whether Mike Brown
had his hands
his hands up or not. But what we know is ultimately the officer fired 12 rounds. And Mike Brown, at the end of that interaction, was dead. And that situation is what sparked protests in Ferguson and all kinds of upheaval that just echoed throughout the nation. We also know that ultimately the officer was acquitted. He did resign from Ferguson Police Department after that. And I'm not sure if he's an officer or not to this day. That's something that we can maybe research. I don't know. And so that story is kind of, really what sparked at least the modern movement against police brutality and police officers' treatment of minorities in America, right? Y'all have any thoughts or input? Did I summarize that okay?
Yeah, no, that was good. I mean, the other note I have here was that Mike Brown's body lay in the street for 4 hours afterward before getting, I don't know what the procedure is, but that seems kind of crazy.
I don't know what is typical, but that does feel
Side
brutal.
note, I remember being in South Africa a couple years ago, and there was a shooting and close to where we were, and the body was there like all day, laying on the street.
Mercy.
That was so weird.
Mercy.
I also think that at the time, they didn't realize that case, the way it blew up and became such a big national case.
They had no
certainly
idea.
scrutinized elements of the case. I think in a way that other cases haven't been. But, I think hindsight being 2020, it probably would have made sense to have the coroner out more, quickly and get, because the imagery, this kid, bleeding out in the middle of the street, man, is a lot. You know what I mean? So.
I think the case this one's a harder one. This one's more complicated to kind of weed out and get details. And even reading the Department of Justice report that we read, it's a hard case to look at. But you're seeing pain, you're seeing hurt, you're seeing issues. And I think it was like a powder keg waiting to go off. Like seeing a people that feel oppressed, that feel hurt, that when this happens, it felt like this almost natural reaction. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying some of the reactions. I'm not saying rioting or, I'm not justifying those things, but it feels like a pressure cooker, and when certain things happen, whether it's any of the things we're talking about today, it feels like it's just a powder keg waiting to go off.
And this is why. This is why these incidents. So we've been talking a lot just as we process issues of race. And there's three kind of factors that I think help to validate a certain perspective. It is history, experience, and statistics. Those three things. Because I want to get away from just narrative. And what I mean is one of the things that are popular in this day is people are talking about his truth, their truth. I'm uncomfortable with that phrase. Because I think there's truth and then there's experience. You understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
And we can't build a movement or a protest or change around his truth or her truth.
That's a good word.
You know what I'm saying?
That's really good. That's helpful.
So when we look at policing in America and why these situations seem to blow up, it's again three things. It's history, it's experience, it's statistics.
That's good.
So from a perspective of history, right? Historically, there's been a very negative relationship between law enforcement and black communities.
Absolutely.
And it dates back to Reconstruction. After the Civil War, there were federal guidelines that basically made freed slave citizens. And for several years after the Civil War ended, federal troops occupied southern states to help enforce those guidelines. Eventually, there are elections. And in the elections, there's a standstill, there's a give and take, and in that give and take, fear of another civil war.
Yep.
A mediation is meted out. And long story short, in that mediation, federal troops then withdraw from the South. They're removed. And so once they're removed, Southern states begin to roll back the legal freedoms that Black folk had received after the Civil War.
Yep.
And so in terms of who was responsible in a lot of these cases of administrating the rollback of these freedoms, it was law enforcement. And it's an unfortunate and a dark part of our history. But police officers were used to deter Blacks from voting, to deter Black families from moving into certain neighborhoods. If you were Black and walking after dark, you were often pulled over and harassed, not having done anything, but just being out after dark. Go ahead.
I'm pretty sure I read that there were laws too that Black people could be arrested because if they didn't have a job, like if you were out on the street and you didn't have a job, you could be arrested and put in prison for years or whatever.
Yeah. So as the Jim Crow system emerged,
for sure that
they began to institute these laws, and sometimes not even laws, but it's ordinances.
Right.
Like you could be ticketed for vagrancy, if you didn't have a job.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so you have displaced, former slaves that are trying to figure life out, and so now they're being ticketed with amounts of money they can't pay, and ultimately you got a warrant for your arrest. You end up in jail, and so you see the police being complicit in helping building this new structure in the South that's now that we now look back on called the Jim Crow South.
Yeah.
But then also you look at what's happening in places like California and New York. In even what we was kind of more progressive states where Black folk are free, and even then there's still these negative experiences with law enforcement on the street on a regular basis. And so from that time moving forward, there's repeatedly this historical narrative or understanding of a very rocky, adversarial, oppressive relationship with law enforcement in Black history and Black communities. So this is well documented stuff. So again, this is not her truth, his truth. This is well documented interactions, again, that go back to, early 1900s, all the way, up until the 60s, the 70s. You look at even the founding of the Black Panther Party. That party was founded to take a stance against police brutality. And it wasn't about necessarily overthrowing and killing white folks as much as it was about the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms to protect yourself, and how they use that to try to deter deter police brutality in a sense. And again, I'm not saying we align with Black Panther principles, any of those things, but I simply use it as a response to a historical understanding that police brutality was just very bad in Black communities for an extended period of time. So that's history.
Right. And to oversimplify that, I feel like if we recognize and we see that systemic racism has existed, like in ordinances and laws, well, what's the arm that enforces that?
Yeah.
And so if we've had terrible laws or laws that have kept certain groups of people down or elevated other groups of people, well, then the enforcer of those laws would be police departments. So, of course, there's this tension and there's this historical clashing, if you will, over time. Of course it is.
Right. And I was just going to say, some people I think saw Ferguson and were like, whoa, why does it feel like it's Black people versus police? Why is that? But again, it's, to your point, it's a history that has been a part of our history. So even today, you see Black Lives Matter and the response is Blue Lives Matter. It's a symptom of what has been there for years.
Yeah, and even as the Ku Klux Klan, at the height of its membership, many of its members were law enforcement officers, judges, clerks, like people that kind of were seen as holding, the power, mayors and civic leaders and all these people who were firefighters, power brokers in those communities. So at the height of membership, those are the individuals. And again, this is factual, documented information. This isn't my truth. And I want to be clear, that's not what this is about. So that's the historical point. Second one is experience. So experience gets to narrative. So it's not just a historical vantage point that you look at. Now, me as a black man, I look at my own interactions with law enforcement. And how there's been moments when I was judged based on what I looked like versus who I was. Now, one of the things I'm thankful for, just because of where I grew up and how I grew up and who my family was, oftentimes once an officer ran my name, things always change. But there were 2 or 3 instances when I was pulled over with friends and there's an unneeded aggression immediately. But then once, you start taking IDs and running names, it's like, oh, you Pastor Kirby's son. Yes, sir. And then there's a oh, okay. And so things change at that point in terms of the interaction. Just because in the city I grew up in, my dad was just so known in the community and working with city officials and even law enforcement and all of that kind of stuff, but so there's the personal experience element of, okay, so there's a historical narrative. Then there's, and this is the thing, when we talk about negative experience, it's not always physical violence. Sometimes it's unnecessary disrespect.
Right.
It's officers, shut up, sit down, don't open your mouth again. Like there's this unnecessary disrespect that at times happens when you're in black communities from law enforcement. So it's unnecessary aggression, not always physical violence, but disrespect. That's not necessary. You understand what I'm saying? And so there's those 2, and then there's statistics. So you look around the country, you look at black folk being 13% of the population, and you look at statistical data, and we're going to have some conversations about statistics and law enforcement that are fascinating, right? You look at statistical data with unarmed black folks being shot versus our representation of the overall population. And you see things that make you say, So there seems to be some degree of statistical consistency around the nation with and again, it's not just being shot, physical violence. It's also complaints of harassment, disrespect, so it's not just people being killed. It's brutality in general and how it seems to be meted out in black communities versus other communities. Now, let me also say, when we look at crime, of course, crime factors obviously aren't a big part of this statistical information. And what I mean is some people immediately think, well, black folk are just more criminal. Now, statistics don't prove that. You understand what I'm saying? Definitely poorer in terms of, disproportionate representation of poverty, but not more criminal.
Compared to, because, I don't have the data in front of me, but it's from what I've studied or looked at, it seems like, when you compare income levels or whatever, especially poor white people commit as many crimes as poor black people, is what it seems like. But black people tend to be more poor in general than white people, so it seems like the data would skew.
Statistically, not in terms of raw numbers. Because in raw numbers, of course, there's more poor white folk than poor black folk. But when you talk about per capita and you look at the percentage, it's disproportionate.
The other thing that's confusing about some of the statistics is you think about criminal convictions and you think anybody that's on the richer end is going to have better lawyers, and is going to be able to get away with the things, and it can be marked as not convicted of crimes because they were innocent. Well, they lawyered up. You get what I'm saying? And so disproportionate in terms of socioeconomic can even change some of those statistics and how those are read out.
So bringing it back to Mike Brown, why did it blow up?
That's a great question. I think it's connected to the conversation we're just having. I think history, experience, statistics point to, and then you see or you read about what has happened, and automatically you connect it to, again, history and experience and all these things that have happened. And so immediately, if you're black, you jump to this conclusion because it's like, here we go again. Here, another one of us, and it's based on negative experiences with law enforcement. It's based on a history of relationship with law enforcement in black communities. It is based on this consensus that you see around the nation of black folk and law enforcement, and this, relationship that is volatile and seemingly abusive a lot of times. And so again, it automatically becomes this powder keg of, right away.
I think history and experience and like what you're talking about has so much to do with it. Because I remember a moment, And I'm grateful for these moments because I can look back and reflect on how powerful they were. A different case, but a nationwide case when I was in high school. We're taking the Wayback Machine. The O.J. Simpson trial. I remember the results of that, the day they announced it, like that he was innocent. And I remember the cafeteria I was in. I grew up at Waukegan High School, a very diverse school. The cafeteria I was in, two distinct things happening. I remember black girls legitimately dancing with joy at OJ being found not guilty. And I remember white people sitting at the table legitimately saying, that dude's a murderer and this is not okay. And I was like, two different Americas right here. Wow. Two different experiences of life, two different ways of seeing the world. And I was tangibly watching it. Now, honestly, I didn't react either way. I was just watching, if I'm completely honest. Yeah. And I was blown away by both. I distinctly remember. I remember what cafeteria I was in. I could see the girls dancing. I'm like, how much joy over this. They don't know OJ, and they're dancing like the greatest things ever happened. And other people are so mad that how could injustice happen in America? This dude killed his wife.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, I think, and not to get into a deep dive on even that subject, but this is something we should talk about in our final podcast for this season. I think the joy that black folk expressed, number one, I don't think it's right. So let me start by saying that. I mean, watching the trial, my belief is that I think OJ got off for committing murder. Mm-hmm. Of course, he's been proven innocent, so I don't have any.
Right.
But I mean, the consensus was, I think this guy did it, and just. Yeah. But the reason why black folk were joyous at that time period is because they felt like for the first time, white people got a taste of injustice.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And it's not a godly perspective at all. So it's not anything I'm condoning. I'm just seeking to try to explain the perspective of navigating of why people were happy about something that seemed so wrong and unjust. It was basically, well, now you see how it feels. Mm-hmm. Because the thought was black folk are normally on the wrong end of injustice in courtrooms and in cases. And now for the first time, you get to see how it feels. Yep. You know what I'm saying? And that's how people felt at that moment.
Which isn't okay, like you said, but understandable. You understand where it's coming from.
Well, yeah, you understand that again, that there's such a, you see the results of what brokenness and perversion and injustice has birthed. Now it's to the point that people will celebrate injustice perceived against white folks as some sort of get back.
Yep.
Yeah. And it speaks to just a brokenness in terms of, the psychology and thinking of that.
Absolutely.
Like you're cheering up, what about the family, the people that he killed? You know what I'm saying? And it's no thought to those. He became a symbol of something.
Yep.
You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
And it's unfortunate in the sense of, as a symbol, there's such a detachment from maybe the facts of the case in that situation.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And I guess that's the sad part about the situation,
So when people saw Mike Brown
bring it
killed,
back.
They're thinking, here's another unarmed black kid, 18 years old.
Yeah.
Which, depending on who you believe, had his hands up.
Maybe.
You know what I'm saying? I'm not saying he did or didn't, but I'm saying in terms of receiving the narrative, an unarmed black man with his hands up.
And there's no clear evidence either way on that. That point.
Well, what the Department of Justice report does say is that he was about 2 or 3 feet away from the officer.
Yep.
And he began to move toward the officer.
He had turned around.
Yeah, he's already injured at this point because he's been shot already.
In the hand already.
Yep. And so some reports say that he was charging the officers. Some say he was just moving toward the officer. Yeah. There's conflicting reports of what he was doing in that moment. Yeah. So yeah, and so he shot. I mean, but for me, the Mike Brown case is a more difficult case in some ways.
Yeah.
Because again, if we look at George Floyd, if we look at Jacob Blake and some of the other cases, especially George Floyd, there's such a heinous police brutality there that there's no justification for what we saw, right? What we witnessed. And not to jump to a more modern case, but the Mike Brown situation,
it's harder.
It's harder in the sense that it's difficult. But I hate to say this, but as the facts of the case and the interaction came out, it created a different picture of what happened that day.
Right. Because we didn't know all those interactions. We didn't know that he
Because initially, the nation saw an unarmed black kid with his hands up get shot 10 times by a police officer.
Yeah. Right. Mercy.
And it's only after investigation and reports and witnesses find out there's a lot more to the story than that. And I'm not saying that Mike Brown's shooting is justified. But what I am saying is that there's already a violent interaction between him and that officer prior to that leads to him being shot in the hand. And from that, everything spirals out of control. I guess the only thing I wish could have played out differently is that officer could have got his taser versus his firearm when he was in the car. But the question is, did Mike Brown put him in that position when he reached in the car? And whether he punched him, whether he tried to grab him, whatever, like when he reached in the car, he put himself in a dangerous position.
But I will say
some
reports from that Department of Justice report talked about how some witnesses said that the officer reached out of the car first and reached at Michael Brown. And so some people are arguing, now the case is conflicting. What really happened, honestly, we don't know. But that does give some of that complication, that minutia to work through in that case. It's complicated. It's hard.
So let's jump to 2020 here.
Okay.
Let's talk through George Floyd a little bit, because that's a little bit more one where I think most everybody is like, this was not okay.
Yeah.
Right? So less gray, but more black and white. But it's sparked a whole lot of stuff in 2020, a whole lot of protests and rioting. So let's kind of just talk.
And I would say after Mike Brown, George Floyd is probably the next biggest in terms of national coverage and
around the world.
Well, I would say George Floyd is even bigger than Breonna Taylor.
Yeah. And
in terms of national or worldwide.
Yeah, really worldwide.
I mean, they were protesting in France and England and about George. So just in terms of, I guess, influence and reach, George Floyd became a bigger story.
Yeah.
Right? That's what I'm saying.
Yep.
So
that's good. So talk through George Floyd, who he is, what. So 46-year-old father of 5 kids. Let's see what else here. He, in high school and college, he had athletic dreams of turning pro and had a scholarship at Texas A&M. Anyway, let's see. In 2009, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. He was arrested several times on drug and theft charges. After prison in 2013, Floyd decided to turn his life around and volunteered at a church. He moved to the Twin Cities, became a mentor, worked as security guard at Salvation Army's Harbor Light Center, which was a homeless shelter. He drove trucks, worked as a bouncer at a club, but because of COVID...
Hold on, you're missing something important.
Okay.
He was also connected to the legendary rap crew, the Screwed Up Clique. Houston's third world DJ Screw. If you're a hip hop historian, then you got to know Big Floyd was connected to the Screwed Up Clique. Shout out to Houston, the whole legacy of DJ Screw and underground Houston hip hop. All right, I got to get that out.
Surprised I didn't know that.
I know you didn't know that. Okay. Don't worry about
it. So anyway, he was a bouncer at a club, but because of COVID, that was shut down, so he found himself out of a job. So here's what happened. May 25th, 2020, Floyd was with 2 others in a convenience store. The employees accused him of paying for cigarettes with a counterfeit $20 bill, and they called the police. When 2 officers arrived, Floyd was sitting with 2 others in a car parked around the corner. After approaching the car, one of the officers, Thomas Lane, pulled out his gun and ordered Mr. Floyd to show his hands. In an account of the incident, prosecutors,
You're doing fine.
Do not explain why Mr. Lane thought it was necessary to draw his gun. Mr. Lane, prosecutor said, put his hands on Mr. Floyd and pulled him out of the car. Then Mr. Floyd actively resisted being handcuffed. But once handcuffed, Mr. Floyd became compliant while Mr. Lane explained he was being arrested for passing counterfeit currency. Court transcripts from the police body camera show Mr. Floyd appears cooperative at the beginning of the arrest, repeatedly apologizing to the officers as they approach his parked car. Then about would be 8:14 p.m. Mr. Floyd stiffened up, fell to the ground, and told officers he was claustrophobic, according to the report. Mr. Chauvin, so another police officer, arrived at the scene. He and other officers were involved in a further attempt to put Mr. Floyd into the police car. During this attempt, so now at 8:19 p.m., Mr. Chauvin pulled Mr. Floyd away from the passenger side, causing him to fall to the ground, the report said. He lay there face down, still in handcuffs, and that's when witnesses started to film Mr. Floyd, who appeared to be in a distressed state. Mr. Floyd was restrained by officers while Mr. Chauvin placed his knee between Mr. Floyd's head and neck. For 7 minutes and 46 seconds, Mr. Chauvin kept his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, and this is the video that went viral.
Worldwide, man.
The duration was initially given as 8 minutes and 46 seconds, but after
the official report came out, and they said it was 7 minutes.
7 minutes
and
and
48 seconds.
Yep.
The transcripts of body cam footage from officers Lane and Alexander Kang show Mr. Floyd said more than 20 times he could not breathe as he was being restrained. He was also pleading for his mother and begging, please, please. At one point, Mr. Floyd gasped, "You're going to kill me, man." Man, watching that video and seeing him say that was just so heart-wrenching. At 8:27, Mr. Chauvin removed his knee from Mr. Floyd's neck. Motionless, Mr. Floyd was rolled onto a gurney and taken to the hospital in an ambulance. He was pronounced dead an hour later.
Yeah.
So since then, all four officers involved were fired. Right? Mr. Chauvin on May 29th was charged with murder and manslaughter. Now there was instantly protests and rioting and pressure to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right? So, some could argue that the police department did the right thing and fired these officers. Other people say they wouldn't have done the right thing unless
the question becomes, was it because of the pressure of protest, and the national stage, or is it something that would have happened?
Right. Is the system set up in such a way to weed out bad policing? You know what I'm saying? Or is it only a response to a nationwide, worldwide uproar?
Attention? Yeah,
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, that's the question or debate around the movements after that. Now, this is obviously probably the most heartbreaking visual of police brutality in modern history, I would say. You can't find a law enforcement official anywhere in the nation that would try to justify what they saw from that officer, especially with a man already being detained, already being handcuffed.
Yeah.
Nobody, there's nobody that is willing to or trying to validate what we see in the George Floyd video and that experience. I guess the big question is that an isolated incident of a terrible officer?
Yep.
Excuse me. Or does it speak to a bigger problem in policing?
Yep.
And was the actions of the officer racially motivated, or was he just a bad apple? Those are really the questions, because again, everybody knows, okay, this guy is obviously some kind of bad apple, but does it speak to a bigger problem?
Yep.
Because right now we brought up two cases, one from 2015, one from 2020, and there's been so many others as well. There's Breonna Taylor, there's Tamir Rice, there's Eric Garner, there's Philando Castile. So many cases have gained national attention of unarmed African Americans being killed in the hands of police.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Yes, so many different cases. And these are just the ones that get national attention. So is there some type of connection to these things happening? Or is it just isolated every once in a while? There's a bad apple in a police department that does something crazy or does something racist, or whatever. And that's the heart of the conversation that we have to have, and that our nation is having and processing and engaging in. All over the country, there's questions about police reform and what needs to change. Does anything need to change? And if so, what do we need to change in our nation? Right. So that's kind of where we are in terms of our nation and these conversations. And I want to say again, as we talk about these things, in no way is even our conversation today or many of the conversations and things that are happening around the nation anti-police.
Yeah.
Now, don't get me wrong. There are movements that want to dismantle police.
Yep.
But what I'm saying is I want to make sure we're clearly distancing ourselves from that. Because
the problem is, I think the reaction from pro-police individuals, and I think police themselves, because there's this brotherhood amongst police officers that, like, regardless of anything, we're going to get each other's back. Because it is such a high stress. You see this a little bit even as pastors. In general, my gut reaction is to back up my brothers. Of course, because I know what they're going through. I know what it is to shepherd. I know what it is to care for people and be accused of this, this, and this, even though your heart is, I'm trying to minister to the people. Like, I know what it is. And so my gut reaction is to protect my brothers. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But I think there's such a brotherhood of, like, even this discussion now. I know some people, they've already tuned out because they're like, oh, they just hate police. No, I don't. I've never hated police.
And the funny thing is other people, because we're not being as hard on police officers, are like, oh man, they selling out.
Yep.
You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Like, so there's people that are going to be angry
100%.
regardless when they watch this podcast.
Of all of our episodes, people are just mad from this one.
Yep.
And really what we're trying to do is discuss that there are some nuances here. And we're talking about real people's lives and real officers that have enough power to keep that life or take that life.
And this is the thing. And you mentioned something profound, I think, when you were talking about as a pastor, how our initial reaction is to come to the aid of our brothers in a way. But even in that, we have to find the balance of accountability, of being understanding and supportive in some ways,
100%.
but also not standing up for that which is wrong.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely.
And I think, and as we get into law enforcement reform conversations, part of it is you know, the blue wall of silence, what do they call it? This notion of supporting somebody doesn't mean I have to support when you are wrong.
Right.
And it's an interesting dynamic of how officers or law enforcement in general, lean on criminals, to snitch and to cooperate and to give up other criminals. But sometimes in law enforcement, there's this perspective that officers won't tell on, I guess, other officers when they do things that are illegal.
And if they do, they are ostracized, and it's a terrible experience. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can't, that's a line that can't be crossed. Whereas, like, in terms of shepherding, pastoring churches, right? I love you guys, but if you're doing something tragic that's hurting other people, I'm going to call you out, and I'm going to stop you, because hiding that or suppressing that isn't helpful for anyone.
Yeah. And now let me be clear as well. All law enforcement agencies aren't created equal.
Sure.
There's some departments that have begun to operate in some very healthy ways and put together a culture that's a lot different from that.
I'm glad you said that.
And I want to be clear about it, because I want to be clear that we're not painting a picture, that every police department is 90s LAPD Rampart scandal. If you follow that story, there was this group of officers that kind of were complicit in a lot of heinous, evil things. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
So I want to make sure that even as we navigate this conversation, it's not an indictment on all things law enforcement, but it's understanding that we're seeing enough consistency in culture that demands looking at our approach to law enforcement in America. Period. Period.
I think just on this note, talking specifically about George Floyd, right? Lawrence Sherman, who's the director of Cambridge Center for Evidence-Based Policing in Cambridge, UK, suggests that, he says, if a state agency was keeping track of everyone's disciplinary history, they might have taken Derek Chauvin out of policing business 10 years ago.
Yep.
Chauvin had received 18 complaints against him even before he put his knee on George Floyd's neck.
Wow, yeah.
And Lawrence Sherman says, we monitor performance of doctors.
Yeah.
Why don't we monitor the performance of police officers?
Right.
And I think this is part of the problem and reform that needs to happen. There's not a database of all policing complaints or issues or disciplinary actions. Police officers can be, dismissed from a department for bad behavior and then rehired at a different department, and they're not doing proper checks with the previous department. Like, is this person okay to still be a police officer. And Derek Chauvin is a great example. This probably never would have happened if he was put out of police force for all these issues that have been going on for years.
Wow. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And so we talk about reform. These are the types of conversations. These are the type of things that need to be had. Looking at complaints, looking at disciplinary history, creating actual performance reviews.
Yep.
That help to catch and point out some of these things. So again, we talk about police reform. It's not an indictment. I think one of the challenges, and I said this in our Whose Life Matters episode, is that policing is such a respected and prominent job field in our nation, in the sense that, you think about police officers, the respect you get when you're in uniform.
Yep.
Children running up to you, free food at restaurants, just the appreciation, especially from white communities, of just the love, the outpouring of love, just historically. We think about like the Barney Fife walking the beat, and the whole town loves, it is one of America's most beloved professions in that sense. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, but the challenge is that now, with an outcry for change and reform and criticism, for a lot of law enforcement agencies and individuals, is viewed as hatred. And it's not. Critique is not the same as hatred. And we have to be able to separate those that have ill will toward law enforcement in general versus honest, wholehearted critique.
Right.
And to say that any critique of modern law enforcement is somehow hatred. It's unfair and unrealistic. And even to say, if you're not a police officer, you don't understand, and you don't have a right to say anything, it doesn't make sense anywhere else in America.
Right.
Because people critique, you critique your doctor. I mean, the Packers played the other day, and every fan had a critique of what Aaron Rodgers did or didn't do.
Oh, I got
and
critiques.
None of them have thrown a football. You know what I mean? So my point is, we accept a degree of critique in almost any other field.
That's a good word.
But suddenly there's this taboo with law enforcement where if you openly critique how it's done, somehow it makes you anti-police.
Yep. That's really good.
And we have to be able to walk through the nuances of a cry for reform versus a cry for dismantlement. You know what I mean?
Bro, we critique even what we do for a living. We critique how the church runs. We want to be as biblical as we can possibly be. And that has even driven us to our stepping forward in terms of understanding multi-ethnic church. That's criticism has brought us to that point of, I don't know that we've been doing this completely right, or there's a better way, or there's a better way of doing things. We can minister to our communities around us. We can bring the gospel in a greater way. We can more live out what the Bible is showing us to do through criticism. Now, that doesn't mean just dismantling without building anything up. It's not just deconstruction.
And that's the key. And when you talk about reform, the whole notion of the word reform is just that. It's not just tearing down.
Absolutely.
It is saying what practices, what policies, what procedures do we change, replace, update to get better outcomes from what we're doing.
Absolutely.
And that's super important because I'm telling you that there is a aggressive, old school, misogynistic form of policing that was embraced in America that still shows itself in a lot of departments around the country. And that element has to be stomped out and changed. You know what I mean? Like, I've talked to command staff, people with a lot of skin in the game in terms of officers who, of course, wouldn't come forward and say this publicly. But there's an old school busting heads, macho, aggressive nature that people assign to policing that isn't helpful.
And the media fans that. I don't mean media like the news. I mean movies, man. Like, how many police officer movies or shows are there? And there's the bad guy, and they're going to go into the room and beat the information out of them because it's important.
Our heroes.
I don't want anyone beating any information out of me ever. Because I have rights.
I mean, that's so
you feel me?
Our heroes in action movies, our officers that blur the lines and break the law.
Like
in our movies.
Man, that's what I'm saying. I mean, that's the perfect example.
I mean, you're so right. And so we created this culture where we think that's policing. Like that, I'm willing to break the law and bend the line, and do all these things. To get the guy, and it's it's a culture that has been embraced. And also something that people aren't talking about enough is mental health in law enforcement and that connection. That's
hard.
There are elements of PTSD.
Mental health on both sides.
Well, I mean, even for specifically, let's just talk about law enforcement first.
Yeah.
Just PTSD with the reality of spending your life seeing kind of the underbelly of society, right? You're just dealing with violence and criminality and issues that regular people don't deal with on the daily basis. Right. And that stuff weighs on you. It takes your perspective of the world. It leads to depression. It leads to elements of PTSD. And it becomes difficult over time to not develop an us against them mentality. And over time, it becomes difficult to not just see people as a threat. And so every time you get a call, your mind is racing around, this could potentially be that. And this person could have this because I've seen it, because I've experienced it. And so there's a great need for mental health amongst officers in law enforcement. And how do we bring elements of counseling? And how do we use that at times to maybe take officers off the street, even if it's just temporarily? Hey, you need a break. How do we demand that officers actually go through therapy on a regular basis to help process and down? Because you look at like divorce rates in law enforcement, you look at, drinking rates and some of these kinds of things with alcoholism, it's connected to mental health. It's a stressful job, maybe the most stressful job. And that amount of stress without being able to process that from a professional mental health perspective, I think it leads to so many, not just unhealthy habits, but like the outer working of that in interactions with people, that's difficult, so how do we even bring that element into law enforcement in our nation where we help officers process these things? We live in the city of Kenosha, Wisconsin, by the way. And one of the things I'm proud about KPD is that KPD is one of the few departments that actually has a mental health officer. There's a trained detective in KPD that specializes in mental health issues. And I would love to see, I think that department needs to be expanded in Kenosha.
Mental
and I would love to see
for the police officers.
For the police department, for officers to help process all of these kinds of things.
Good.
And I think those types of programs need to be expanded nationwide. Right?
Absolutely.
And even just the other side of mental health, the people that you're interacting with so often can have mental health issues too. And so, something that I'd like to see is an expansion of people that go in recognizing there's a mental health crisis, instead of it just being police officers also having to respond to that. Maybe having people that are more trained to help mental health patients or things, people that they're having a mental health episode, like they need to go to a hospital, and so can we have people that are trained to de-escalate, calm those people down, instead of someone who's trained to shoot and having to deal with all these situations as well. I think one of the stresses for police officers is there's so many things they're required to do and so many different situations that they could be called upon for. And to be able to train them well enough to handle all these different scenarios, I think is a challenge. So I'd like to see some more specialization.
Yeah. And I think you're on the right track because I've heard this from actual officers. Again, in our local context at KPD, that a bulk of calls that police officers get called to are stuff that really has nothing to do with law enforcement.
Right.
It's just like 911 is the only thing you call for help. And it speaks to your point of oftentimes there's mental health, even some of the domestic disputes. If it hasn't gotten to a place of actual violence where a crime has been committed, like y'all need a counselor. You don't need a police officer. And so police officers call to somebody's home because they're having an argument and they're throwing stuff. Nobody's gotten hurt yet. But now they're trying to mediate this husband and wife.
It's hard.
And and there's all these things that's not what we're supposed to be doing.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And maybe there should be, a police officer standing nearby in case it does escalate to a place where, but yes, having that first interaction be someone that's more trained, again, to de-escalate the situation and bring calm and peace in that sense.
Yeah, being able to have officers maybe, and again, a program that people smarter than us would have to sit down and think through.
Right.
But do police officers arrive on the scene, assess the situation, and then bring in support that might be a doctor or a therapist or whoever to help actually deal with some of the issues, beforehand, or when there's recognized activity in areas, being able to call in resources to say, hey, we need some people to come and serve these families, because there's problems in these houses, there's interactions in these, like community coming together to actually figure out how can we help people be beyond police officer interaction and locking people up.
And understanding too that because of the history, when you send a police officer into a black community for, an argument, let's say, there's instantly a mistrust of that police officer. Sure. There's not a sense of, oh, this is a person who can come calm the situation down and help mediate and solve. Right. It's, oh no, this is getting escalated instantly. And
they're coming to take people to jail.
They're coming to take people to jail.
That's the thought in inner city amongst black folks.
Right. And so, just, I don't know what all the solutions are, but, hopefully we need to have these kind of conversations to think of solutions and help to better our police officers and our communities.
Yeah. And I also think we need to redevelop training. I think we need to look at the academy, the police academies in general, and rethink how we train law enforcement officers around the country. Because their job is so big, because it's so much responsibility, because it requires so many nuances, I just think there should be more training. I think the academies and the curriculum we see is lackluster, and it leaves a lot out, And again, I have it on pretty good authority from our local perspective that new hires that come through academies, often when they go into the field officer training program, they're told, like, listen, forget the nonsense you learned at academy. This is what policing is, and this is how to do it here.
So now they're unlearning.
Yeah.
They're having to.
That's right. Yep. And there's, again, these are some of the things.
Yeah.
These are some of the thoughts and ideas that come from actual law enforcement officers. So I want to be clear as we're having this conversation. We're not just making up some of this. It's stuff that I've talked to officers about.
And that's
people in leadership.
That's a good point too.
That suggested some of these things.
I've never been through officer training.
Yeah.
I have friends and family that have been or are in the police force, but so I understand some of it and what they've shared. But I'm not the one to probably implement and speak into always the best things that need to change. We need to have police officers speaking about that.
Yes, that's right.
And that's important to have their perspective as well as the perspective of the community.
That's right.
It's something that we have to come together on and not instantly have this argument and fight and throwing stuff or yelling at each other. Like, we have to have helpful conversations so that for the betterment of our society.
Yeah. And one of the things I'm thankful for is many of you may not know this, but for 4.5 years, I was a police and fire commissioner for the city of Kenosha. And so I had the privilege to serve our city's police department, participate in the process of actually hiring our current police chief and our current fire chief. Like from start to finish, I was part of that process, overseeing officer discipline and just a lot of different elements of local policing in KPD. So it was a privilege to be able to serve in that capacity, learn a lot about local policing, kind of understand some of the nuances of police culture, even though still from a distance. Like I wasn't an actual police officer, but the opportunity to serve in that capacity gave me, honestly, a newfound respect and understanding for what modern law enforcement is, and what it should look like. So when I share certain perspectives saying officers have said this, it comes through that experience and my time interacting with officers, as well as command staff and different individuals during the time period I served on the Police and Fire Commission, working with them. So, those are kind of the things.
So to bring perspective here, I think, for Bridge the Divide, we're bringing it back to like what the podcast is. Because we talked about so many different things, so many different nuances. I think really a perspective that I'm wanting to chat through and to focus on is, okay, so we have policing, we have things that need to be reformed, we have issues in the community, we have the history that we talked about perspective and all those things. Church response. As Christians, as a church, how do we navigate and what do we do? Because I think this is what's going to be really helpful maybe to the people who might be tuning in Because like what you're saying is important. Police reform needs to happen. And maybe that's something the church can be a part of, is getting behind some of those police reform things within the community and such. But what is the Christian response? What is the church response? What are we supposed to be doing?
Yeah, that's a really great question.
Yep.
I think the first thing we have to do is resist the urge to be polarized.
That's very good.
Because that's, I mean, the biggest frustration for me in this is that immediately it becomes either you're for the police or you're anti-police.
Yep.
And like there's no other options.
Yep.
So either you agree with everything we do and you got our back, or you hate us and you want to like,
you're either with us or you're against us.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, I mean, I think of scripture, the story of Joshua when the angel appears. I don't remember where that
here
is
we
at,
go.
But,
Here, this is good.
Are you? And he sees the angel of the Lord with the sword, and he says, "Are you for us or against us?" And the angel says, "Neither."
Neither.
Like I represent the host of the Lord. I'm something altogether different.
Yep.
And so this, we have to resist the urge to be polarized.
That's very good.
And be able to see the nuances and again the complexity of issues, and find ways to lovingly support law enforcement, and lovingly support the community, and find ways to bridge those divides, no pun intended, and bring people together. How do we reform in terms of law enforcement? How do we bridge that gap with Black communities and impoverished communities and the mistrust of police officers that's based on history, that's based on these experiences? How do we change that? And how do we help bring these entities together in a way that can build something positive moving forward? One of the big buzzwords in modern policing is community policing. And it's all these different models and strategies to help the police departments and the communities work together. You know what I mean? And that's super important. That's super important going forward. Is how do we continue to pioneer and push forward in community policing models that allow officers and community members to work together, to trust each other, to understand one another, and be able to move forward in those ways. You know what I mean?
I do. I think the compassion is helpful from the church as well. This isn't so much as like a overall movement, but I think compassion has to build up, and an understanding of hurt and pain and struggle needs to build up within the church. So, for example, Michael Brown, we were talking about Michael Brown, and shout out to Nate Goss who did our research. He put this in the research. He's talking about, he's quoting some articles, and he wrote, shortly before his death, at the urging of his grandmother with whom he lived and his uncle, the Reverend Charles Ewing, he embraced Christianity.
Wow.
And I remember even reading about Trayvon Martin when he was just horrifically gunned down, terrible, tragic. I was a youth pastor at the time, and thinking about Michael Brown when that went down, I'm picturing my students getting gunned down. I've had bigger students that are intimidating, that are freaking puppy dogs. And I love those guys. And I picture my students when I picture Michael Brown. And I picture my students when I think of Trayvon Martin. And I think of children. And listen, and listen, bad mistakes were made. Michael Brown, terrible decisions. Legitimately bad decisions. Trayvon Martin, that's a different thing. Not bad decisions. Okay? But like, Michael Brown, you messed up, buddy. But he didn't deserve that. And I'm not saying, this isn't even a statement on the police officer's decisions and even what went down. We said it was complicated from the get-go. But like, as a church, heartbreak for loss of life. Heartbreak for the breaking down of the Imago Dei. Someone who was created in the image of God was killed. And this is tragic. And how do we love our communities more? How do we show compassion? How do we weep with those who are weeping? How do, as a church, how do white evangelicals in the church see the death of anyone, white, Black, Hispanic, otherwise, as the death of human beings? And how do we as a community grieve the loss of anyone? I'm not saying every single loss we weep because we wouldn't be able to live life. But I'm just saying this is tragic loss. This is painful and this is hurt. And how do we get to a place? And I think it's connected with relationships that we're talking about. I think it's connected. And I talked about this even preaching sermons at church over the years of like if you knew Michael Brown's mother, Michael Brown is different. Even if he doesn't look at you like you, even if he's not your background, whether white, Black, Hispanic, doesn't matter. If you know people and you're in community with them, when someone is lost or hurt, you're going to take it different.
And this is the thing. I want to leave with a final thought as well. we're talking about unnecessary use of force.
Yes.
And use of lethal force as well.
Yeah.
And I want us to kind of clearly state
good.
that as we start to wrap this thing up.
Yep.
We're talking about unnecessary use of lethal force, often against unarmed people, unarmed Black people.
Yeah.
Because in a lot of these cases, we're not saying these individuals are innocent and don't deserve to be arrested.
Right.
But to be killed
Yes.
without posing an imminent threat to an officer or other people is not right. And in many of these cases, the individuals who were killed or shot were not, according to DAT training, defense and arrest tactic training that law enforcement goes through, they weren't posing an imminent threat to an officer or other individuals, yet we're still gunned down. And that's why a lot of these cases are high profile, because some of the things I was hearing, like not just Mike Brown, but you talk about Breonna Taylor, you talk about Jacob Blake, even George Floyd. Immediately there's criminal record being brought up. There's also what these individuals were currently doing. And some of them were in the process of committing crimes or just committed them and deserve to be arrested.
Yes.
Right.
And
George
charged
Floyd.
and locked. If he paid with this counterfeit $20 bill, then whatever the charges are for using counterfeit, that's a federal charge, I know, then he goes through that process.
Absolutely.
Hands down. Jacob Blake shouldn't have been at that necessarily the residence because there was a restraining order, whatever happened. He resisted arrest. He probably should have went to jail. And so there's not, it's, when we talk about what has happened in a lot of these cases, it's not saying that people shouldn't be arrested.
Right.
Because in some of these cases, Mike Brown, if he stole cigars and then assaulted a worker in the store, pushed him over, whatever he did, he should have been arrested for that.
Yes.
And so there's no argument against that. The issue is that in these moments, often law enforcement becomes judge, jury, executioner all in one.
And the escalation of it.
Yes, versus de-escalation.
Even just Mike Brown, right? He stole this stuff. He's in the street. Why did it have to go from that to him being killed? What else? We don't know what else happened. We don't know what was said. And all this
and there's so many cases, so many instances we can unpack. Like, for instance, we didn't even unpack Jacob Blake, who is the local case. But watching that video of how he was shot, there's questions about imminent threat. Not commission of a crime, but imminent threat.
Right.
The Breonna Taylor case, imminent threat.
And and like you said, like what happens after these incidents happen is things come out after the fact about their criminal record. About I don't care about their criminal record. That has nothing to do with getting gunned down.
Correct.
Your criminal record has nothing to do with that. Your criminal record has to do with you getting prosecuted for your criminal acts. And a lot of times, serve time already. Or if not, then time is coming. You get what I'm saying? Get arrested, do that. It's that excessive force. Death is not, you should not be killed for a $20 counterfeit bill. That's not the punishment for that crime.
And what I've been saying for so long now is that it leads to the deeper problem of racism and the thinking that Black people are more dangerous than other people.
Yes.
And say what you want, but there's a narrative, again, and I say this till I'm blue in the face, since 1619 that suggests that Black people are less than human and, super strong, super fast, animalistic, more dangerous than other people. And that thought has permeated cultures from 1619 to 2020. In the 90s, the 80s, when all these, the big headline was Black on Black crime. But you never heard about white on white crime. There was never Mexican crime. There was, the only time race was mentioned in connection to crime was Black on Black. Because it creates this narrative. Well, they're killing each other. And so long before officers put on a uniform, they exist in a culture that has taught them, along with the rest of us, that just Black folk are dangerous. And that's a problem.
It is a problem.
And so, these officers approach these situations with a degree of fear built up because society has taught them that Black folk are dangerous. And so when there's a taser and a gun, you're going for the gun because you're concerned. You know what I mean? And so like those are the things we have to process and break down. You know, so we got to end this podcast, don't we, guys?
Oh, we'll talk forever.
If you feel like we didn't do this conversation justice, please forgive us.
Yeah.
We just ran out of time. There's so much
We
more
had so
to talk
much more
about.
data to even go through.
There's
Bam.
so much more to talk
Yeah.
about on this topic specifically. But again, our heart goes out to those families that have been impacted,
Yes.
and you've lost loved ones
Yeah, that's right.
in altercations with law enforcement officers. It's a very painful situation to have to endure.
Yep.
Again, our heart also goes out to law enforcement officials who have a very difficult job to do on a daily basis.
Yep.
But yeah, there's a perspective in our faith that requires us to be understanding of people.
Yep.
And so that doesn't give us the right to be polarized
I think so.
immediately in these types of situations.
I think so.
Yeah, so that's what it is. Listen, thank you for tuning in.
Yep.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. We would love to hear from you. Thanks again.
And next week will be our last
Yeah,
one
for the season.
one.
Season one is
Yeah.
wrapped
And
up.
then we'll take a break and we'll hit season 2 in the future. But yeah, next week, episode 8, and we'll take a break after that.
I'm so excited.
Thanks for listening to Bridge the Divide. Shout out today to Nate Goss, our research wizard, Chris Marvin, our musical minstrel, Jake Carter, our trusted nobleman, and Doug Cry, our handy innkeeper. Reach out to us with comments or questions by sending us an email at bridgethedividepodcast@gmail.com. If you found this podcast helpful, please do us a favor, hit the subscribe button, and share this episode with a friend. We'll see you next time on Bridge the Divide podcast.